82 years ago this week, a deadly explosion at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine in Concord killed 320 sailors and civilians. Nearly three-quarters of them were black sailors doing some of the military's most dangerous work, loading munitions without training. When survivors of the explosion refused to continue working under the same unsafe conditions, 50 of them were charged with mutiny. It took decades for the Navy to clear their names. They were not fully exonerated until just 2 years ago. Now, the site of the tragedy in Concord is now a national memorial, and that's where this morning there will be a commemoration ceremony starting at 10 o'clock to remember the legacy of the Port Chicago 50. And to talk about that and what happened and what's planned for today, we want to welcome Walt Bilofsky, VP of Treasure Island Museum, and we'll explain the connection between Treasure Island and Port Chicago in just a minute. But we also want to welcome LaMar Vinson. You are the grandson of one of the Port Chicago 50. Tell me, let's start with you, LaMar. Growing up, what did you know about this story?
Nothing.
Wow.
And that is the short answer. We learned of my grandfather's involvement with Port Chicago September of 2025. So this speaks to the great work that Port Chicago Alliance is doing, the partnership with Jonathan Lee, in discovering our family. So this is a very new journey, but a very intentional one for us.
And unfortunately, it was too late at that point. Your grandfather had already passed away. You couldn't go back and ask him what it was like to be part of something like that.
My grandfather died young, so he didn't have the runway to share stories and provide that vocal lineage of what happened. We didn't get that. So this is a reclamation project. And again, with the work that the Treasure Island is doing, Treasure Island Museum and Port Chicago Alliance, again, it speaks to the gravity of what we're dealing with.
And how significant it is then and now. And Walt, I want to ask you, why is it important to remind people of what happened? What's the historical significance of not just the explosion that happened, but the aftermath with these 50 men who stood up for their rights and said, this is not safe for me to continue working in these conditions?
Well, the Navy was segregated. There was racial discrimination. The black sailors were given, as you said, one of the most dangerous jobs. And the working conditions were terrible. Safety was not followed, and the explosion was just disaster waiting to happen. When the men refused to go back to work, the Port Chicago 50, that was really unusual, very unusual.
Because
wartime.
They were charged with mutiny, which in wartime was a capital offense?
An admiral threatened them with death. It wasn't mutiny, it was refusal to disobey orders, but the Navy wanted to make an example of them. And they did make an example of them, not the one they wanted. Because the publicity surrounding the trial, Thurgood Marshall came out, he was chief counsel of the NAACP, he came out, he talked to the press, and although he was not able to get them a new trial, the awareness of the racism in the Navy that was built and publicized by the NAACP led directly to the desegregation of the Navy. It was the first major institution in the United States to desegregate. And that trial on Yerba Buena Island in the city and county of San Francisco was a major turning point.
And that's the connection to Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island. The trial for the Port Chicago 50 happened there.
On Naval Station Treasure Island.
What should people remember or know about this today?
Oh, there's so much. There's a whole book about it written by Professor Robert Allen, and folks should get that book, and it's a great read. And go to portchicagoweekend.org. Find out about what's going on this weekend and find out about the whole Port Chicago story. There's a lot online, and it's a whole
fascinating story, turning point, just historic moment, and a very tragic one. LaMar, you were saying your grandfather, no one in your family talked about this. What was your reaction when you found out that your grandfather was part of this?
So I was made aware by Jonathan Lee, great guy, and one of the things that I mentioned as he was speaking about my grandfather's service and about what happened with this level of respect that no one ever talked about. And I said to Jonathan, I hope you're serious. And he was. And he was very kind and intentional about sharing information, data points, files. And I took a deep dive to really learn and wanted to, again, understand what my grandfather went through, but also knowing the tragedy, start the reclamation project. He and the Port Chicago men, the 50, were heroes, and they need to be recognized as such.
What would you like to say to your grandfather if you could? Did you think about that when you were learning about this?
I did. And first of all, I would say thank you. And I'm sorry you had to experience what you did at the hands of an institution that delivered an empty promise. I can only apologize for what he went through, but the strength, the quiet that we inherited in our family is now the linchpin of us voicing, bringing awareness to what Port Chicago means and its connection here to the Bay Area.
Yeah. It's a Bay Area story, and their legacy continues, and that will be one of the things that's going to be focused on at the commemoration ceremony that's happening today and throughout the weekend. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming in, sharing this very impactful family story with us, and telling us about the significance. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Well, we want to let people know if you want to take part and learn more about this and go in person, 10 o'clock this morning is when that commemoration ceremony begins. It's happening in Concord. There's also a free screening of the movie Glory that's going to be showing at 5 o'clock tonight. Then tomorrow, Remembrance Weekend wraps up with a tour of the historic Red Oak Victory Ship. So a weekend of events to celebrate the legacy and the courage of the Port Chicago 50.